All right, let's get into this discussion now. Suspended Gauteng Judge Tintswalo Makhubele's fate hangs in the balance following damning findings against her by the Judicial Service Commission. It found her guilty of gross misconduct for violating the separation of powers doctrine. This is by being the chair of state-owned entity PRASA while also being a judge. But Makhubele is not alone. And of course, it raises questions about the integrity of the judiciary. Judicial Officers Association of South African President Neelan Karikan joins us in studio for more on this. Neelan, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. What a time, right, for South Africa as we analyze, I suppose, the independence of so many of our institutions, all the way from policing right up until the judiciary, especially following those allegations by General Mkhwanazi. But this matter of the suspended Judge Tintswalo Makhubele facing that possible impeachment. I mean, talk to me about what that particular move and decision by the JSC for you means about whether or not we're getting closer and closer to seeing accountability for our judges.
Absolutely. When it comes to holding judicial officers accountable, obviously the governing body that's responsible is the Judicial Service Committee or Commission. And for the lower court judges, we're looking at the Magistrates Commission. And we need them to be quite effective and be very speedy in whatever they do. As an organization, JOASA, we would not get into the merits. It's not our domain as to whether they should have been convicted and what should actually ultimately happen in Parliament when that process unfolds in respect of the actual impeachment. But the process has to happen, and the Judicial Commission Service needs to be seen to be doing what they're supposed to be doing, because if they don't, then the issue of independence becomes questionable. And how do we really talk about accountability if we don't hold our judicial officers accountable for any conduct or any breach or for any conflict that might bring the whole institution into disrepute? So we need to deal with that. And I think it is happening.
Yeah, if we can go into a little bit more detail about why that misconduct in judges needs to be looked at really closely. I think about just some of the allegations against her, that she was a judge and also served as chair of PRASA. What that does, that lack of a perceived separation of powers, right, the perceived lack thereof, what that does to one's integrity and certainly the confidence that South Africans have in our judges.
Remember, when we speak of judges, we are speaking of judges across the board, from the lower court judges in the form of the district magistrates, regional magistrates, and ultimately the high court judges. It's very important for us to appreciate the separation of powers in the fact that we have the legislature, the executive, and ultimately the judiciary. When those lines get blurred, automatically the independence and the way we are accountable gets affected. And we need to hold ourselves accountable. And the current governing bodies that are dealing with that, I think of recent, they seem to have been speedily operating as compared to the past, inclusive of the Magistrates Commission when we deal with lower court judges. Recently, there has been a lot of activity that has brought quite a few judicial officers to account, and the Judicial Service Commission is now also speedily applying themselves. And I think from a judicial perspective, and for holding ourselves accountable as judicial officers, it's actually a step in the right direction, and we're on the right path.
But generally, the speed that we do see, though, judges being held to account, I mean, you talk about speedily, but that's not necessarily always the case, right?
Absolutely. You will realize historically, and even when we look at it's well publicized, the Motata case, it took at least possibly about 16 years or so to ultimately achieve what it was supposed to achieve. And those types of delays will bring the judiciary into disrepute if we cannot hold ourselves accountable. So when we act immediately, swiftly, then we're actually ensuring that the public at large is aware that the judiciary is holding itself accountable and can effectively operate. So when they come to us as courts, they will definitely have much more confidence in us, in our own decision-making, because we are holding each other accountable. You must know historically, during the era of apartheid, there used to be this discussion or this idea that you just need to be collegial, where the Chief Justice or a senior judicial officer just goes to the transgressing judge and informs them, you are out of line, please correct yourself. And ordinarily back in the day that used to happen because collegiality used to be very, very strong because largely white Afrikaner males were in charge. But with the advent of our new dispensation and with transformation and the different demographics, it seemed that collegiality is a bit lacking, and we need to have a lot of introspection as judicial officers to ensure that as an entity, we need to be united. We need to be collegial with each other, because right now we are heavily regulated and the process might be a bit more convoluted. Sometimes some things need to happen a bit faster. So there might need to be some changes that will allow all these processes to happen quicker to achieve a result, whether a judicial officer needs to be exonerated or whether it needs to be dealt with in terms of removal, suspension, and the like. So those issues we really need to look at, because what has been happening now is unacceptable. We cannot have judicial officers in the system for years that are being paid, and then ultimately you remove. Our taxpayers' monies are being used. And remember, when it comes to lower court judges, you must know there's a big disparity between the High Court and the lower courts. And that disparity is not acceptable, because the lower court judges right now have even taken the president, and we're talking about independence, have even taken the president to court, and the organization that is actually pursuing this has a court date. If I'm not mistaken, it's the 12th of August, in respect of the president having to sign off on a major review and to appoint members to the Independent Remuneration Committee. So we've got judicial officers in different associations taking the executive to court for them to do their job. And then we want to talk about independence. If you do not remunerate our lower court judges effectively, they're ultimately going to get compromised. And how do you hold them accountable if you, as the state and the systems and the stakeholders at large, don't do their job? But you want to hold them accountable to a certain standard, but you don't actually give them security of tenure. You leave them to their own devices. That is the state of the current judiciary. It's very disappointing. We might be speaking currently just because there is the issue relating to the High Court. The majority of our judges come from the lower court. We do 95% of the work. And the Magistrates Commission currently is not capacitated enough to do their work, whether it's transfers, leave, those regulations need to be done. And unfortunately, it seems we've got a long way to go, but we're going to get there. Because as JOASA, we're going to make sure that we achieve a truly clear, single judiciary in the country. In fact, right now there's talk about marching to the Constitutional Court and picketing and handing over a memorandum to our Chief Justice. There is talk already of picketing and going to Parliament at the Union Buildings in Cape Town. So those are stakeholders that have been mobilized. We inclusively have stakeholders in the form of other organizations, inclusive of our traditional leadership nationally. On a national level, the traditional leadership in the country has already bought into this issue, because they are very concerned about holding judicial officers accountable, but they know that we need to be independent, but we're not. Even High Court judges, unfortunately, they're not getting what they're supposed to get.
What do you make of the allegations that we saw made just weeks ago that the country simply cannot stop talking about, right? Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi holds that press briefing, and amongst the many allegations that he puts forward is he speaks of the infiltration of criminal elements, not just in our police, but all the way up to members of parliament and also in the judiciary. I mean, it's a massive allegation. You've got the Office of the Chief Justice that said to him, bring the evidence to us of that infiltration. You've also got this ad hoc committee that kicked off some of its work today. We saw really them appointing the chairperson of that parliamentary ad hoc committee. But those very issues, and if you will, perhaps those two structures, what they need to do to deal with those allegations made by him. But the points that he's made about infiltration of the judiciary, when you heard him say it, did you recognize some of those allegations?
It's very important for you to understand that as judicial officers, as an association, it is not our space or domain to comment about the merits and whether this is true or not true.
Sure.
However, reality must prevail. Reality is such that as judicial officers, we are also human, and we are not infallible. We are also fallible. So these issues or instances of falling off the wagon will happen in every arm of government. We've seen it in the executive, we've seen it in the legislature, inclusive of the judiciary. We've seen, and you've just noticed that there has been a conviction right now and there's potential impeachment. So we're not immune to that. But I can tell you that when it comes to the judiciary, the large majority of judicial officers are doing their job effectively, without fear, favor, or prejudice. But they are reaching a threshold right now that they've been crying for assistance from different stakeholders in terms of tools of trade, remuneration, benefit, security. Can you imagine that junior prosecutors quite often earn more than a magistrate with 20, 30, 40 years of service? That is how neglected, particularly the lower court judges, have been. And if we allow this to happen, then I will probably quite easily agree with you to a large extent about these statements that are coming out. Not that to a degree, there has to be some truth in it. So therefore, I think it's good that there is this movement to have this investigation or whatever needs to be done to get to the bottom.
Right.
Because we should not leave it. Because if it's happening there, it must be happening on every level.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be asking these questions to members of parliament in a few moments, those that are part of the portfolio committee looking into justice. But thank you so much for speaking to us, giving us a glare into the judiciary of our country as we continue to advocate for more and more independence of our judiciary. Mr. Neelan Karikan there, who is the president of the Judicial Officers Association of South Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
We'll continue the conversation on the other side of this. Stay with us.